So how has COVID affected you as a small business owner? Oh, partnership. I understand you're not the sole proprietor.
No, no, but well, I think running a small business on a normal day isn't easy. Um, and my wife Catherine and I opened up the bookstore 22 years ago, and people thought we were crazy, and we thought they thought we were crazy because we're opening up not only a bookstore, but a bookstore in a small town, and and I think at that time we had to contend with big box retail. uh, at that time there were Borders, Barnes and Noble, Amazon really was sort of in the background, but we knew that Amazon actually was the biggest threat, not just to the bookstore, but to small businesses in general. And so both Borders, which uh, was pushed out, Barnes and Noble hangs on by a thread, but Amazon, as you know, continued to increase its dominance in the marketplace. And it should be of nobody should doubt that they don't want to be a player in the marketplace. They want to be the marketplace. And the billions of dollars that they've made in profits since COVID started is really an indication of how much of a dominant force, monopoly force they are within the market, within the economy. So, that was always an issue. How do you maintain small businesses? How do you maintain the strength of a local economy? And, people need to support small businesses and their local economies. And, there's been enough research to indicate that for every $100 somebody spends at a small independent business, you get $80 or $90 coming back, recycling within the community. I've worked with a lot of communities up and down the East Coast, and we know this to be true, whether it's a bookstore, hardware store, independent pharmacy, other community-based, family-run businesses. That's what keeps a local economy going. That's what keeps local communities going, vibrant main streets. But if you spend your $100 at a big box retail, like a Walmart or others, you'd be lucky to get $30 coming back. You spend $100 on Amazon, you get zero coming back. So even before COVID hit, we were dealing with with these issues. But nonetheless, we've been able to hang on. So when COVID hit, ironically enough, for us, and I know for other businesses, even though small businesses, have been shutting their doors since COVID, especially hard hit our restaurants. And again, that's tough work on a normal day, and it's made especially tough as a result of COVID. But when COVID hit, we closed the bookstore early in March last year, and didn't have the building open to the public, and it remains closed to the public today, and I'm sure for many more months to come.
So
But
that's
what
like
we
a
experienced,
curbside,
what's that?
doing like a curbside. You call and say, "Hey, do you got this
Yeah,
book?"
curbside. We've set up an order and takeout window on the side.
Yeah, yeah.
We've done a lot. We have a good presence on Facebook, Instagram, our website, and Catherine's doing a lot of FaceTime with people so they can see not only the books, toys, games, but we have also a gallery featuring about 40 or 50 local artists in
Oh,
Craftsville.
that's cool.
So, just had to shift, but just an incredible outpouring support from the community. And, I think increasingly, as a result of COVID, it's become more apparent to more people that if you want these small businesses to emerge after this crisis, if you want a Main Street that remains intact, you need to commit to making your purchases with these businesses. And so, and I think certainly sales are down. We also do a lot of work with conferences, bookseller. We're the bookseller for a lot of organizations and their conferences. We've always been bookseller for organizations like the Northeast Organic Farmers Association, New Hampshire chapter, the Cooperative Extension Master Gardener Program, others. So that generated a lot of business. Schools and the orders placed from schools continue to be pretty good. But, I think our business has been cut, I don't know, maybe 40%, if not more. And, we've always joked over the 22 years, we've never made a profit. So, there's, nothing different here with COVID.
Well, that's
but we're here to stay. We've
the fact that the doors are still open. There's your profit.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, that's.
But I think again, when we first started the bookstore, we always said it's not about just selling books. It's not just about retail. And we understood that it's about making important connections to the community. And we've always thought that was a pretty good business model. And it's a very good business model, especially when we're faced with the situation we face today with COVID. And when we started the bookstore 22 years ago, none of us had any real business experience in that sense. My wife Catherine started out as an anthropologist. Ended up going into nursing to apply her anthropology more directly. I've been a sociologist and community organizer for the last 50 years. And Catherine's brother, Jim Mitchell, who was a longtime news anchor down in Boston with WBZ. So when Catherine and I wanted to open up the bookstore 22 years ago, we gave him a call, and he essentially retired from the news business and came up to help us run the bookstore. And so that's our history. Both Catherine and I have had though experience in setting up cooperatives. So in that sense, we did have business experience, but with a cooperative structure, that's a structure that connects significantly to the community. And when we were in Connecticut back in the late 70s, we helped put together a worker-managed poultry processing plant. So I guess we did have some related experience in that respect, but it was always, business from a more democratic perspective, more community based perspective. And I think that's always bode well for us. And again, as I said before, especially given what we face in respect to COVID, because the community has been, absolutely wonderful in their outpouring of support and appreciation. And they continue to be with us. And so we're all going to emerge, from this pandemic. Now that, at least at the national level, we have a coherent and competent approach to dealing with this crisis, which we didn't have with the past administration. So,
Right.
in that sense, we're looking forward to, to hanging on here for as long as we need to, and at some point at the end of 2021 or beginning of 2022, hopefully we'll be able to return to that aspect of normal.
Yeah, I'm getting tired of just sitting around doing nothing.
Well, you're not doing nothing. You're doing this.
It's been the longest 2 weeks of my life, I'll tell you. But to get back about what you were saying about all these local communities build for a stronger community, I moved from New Hampshire in 2017, and I moved to Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts,
Yes.
right on the outskirts of Boston. And there was only, as far as like chain establishments, there was a CVS,
Right.
and there was a 7-Eleven, well, 2 7-Elevens, and there was a Goodwill, but everything else was an independently owned,
That's great.
hardware stores, restaurants, secondhand stores,
Yep.
Art gallery, everything, coffee shops. It was all privately owned, and a lot of diversity.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed like you got better service too, because they were glad to see you. They were happy that you came in. They went out of the way to make sure you would come back.
Right.
Ethnic restaurants. Oh my God, the food was so good.
Yep.
I mean, you'd have an Italian restaurant next to a Cuban restaurant, next to a Ethiopian restaurant, and a Japanese restaurant. I mean, you name it.
Well,
all of the food was so good.
Well, it's that's a testament to having a local focus, and appreciating what your community has to offer, and the diversity of the community can be reflected in the kind of restaurants, the kind of businesses. And when you don't have that, and you have all of these chain stores and franchises, it destroys the diversity of community. And, as a sociologist, and you've heard me talk about this before, diversity is important in keeping society going. Human society, as it is necessary for the natural environment. So, when you have community-based, authentic local businesses, those businesses reflect the diversity of the communities in which they operate in. And when you lose those local businesses, those small family businesses, you lose that diversity. And and I think, especially when now in the midst of COVID, which in West Virginia has had decent success in terms of getting vaccinations into people's arms. And one of the most important reasons for that is because West Virginia, unlike a lot of other states, has a strong network of local independent pharmacies. So they're really depending on that network of independent pharmacies to get the vaccinations out. Sorry, hold on just for a second.
Sounds good.
And so, that's yet another example of, being able to respond to crises. And you have those supportive networks in place. And those supportive networks don't exist if you don't have a strong local economy. And the same is true with food. I think one of the things that, many of the things that have become more apparent with this crisis, with this pandemic, is that it reveals the inadequacy and the fragmentation of all of our systems. certainly the fragmentation of our healthcare system, not having universal access to healthcare has, increased the level of pain and suffering that we're going through. And when you have the millions of people who don't have access to healthcare before something like this hits, and then further aggravated by this pandemic, it's tough to be able to respond. And the same is true with food. Our food system has been so centralized that there's a food insecurity has just gone out the roof. And here in Warner, our food pantry before COVID was serving somewhere 50 to 70 households, and now that's over 300 households since COVID, and continuing to expand. The good news about that is that over the last number of decades, we've been working here to build and maintain a strong local food system. We've got a lot of farmers. We've got a lot of organic farmers in and around Warner, and so we're depending on that local food system to be able to meet the increased demand in respect to food. So, very intentionally over the last 30 years or more, we've concentrated on what needs to happen to maintain a strong local economy. And that's, relates to Main Street businesses, it relates to farmers and land use. 3 or 4 years ago, we converted the town of Warner and all of their buildings and properties over to 100% solar. And, that was an important step for dealing with, the climate crisis, but also greater energy self-sufficiency. The bookstore we converted to 100% solar, 14 years ago. So, we've made conscious steps to build our local systems of support. And boy, we really need them now. And we're able to fortunately depend on them, that we have them in place. And, I think that's one of, many reasons why, at the bookstore, we're doing okay. And I know we'll come out of this and survive this, and perhaps even be stronger.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with you about what you said about the local. I witnessed it when I was working and living in Jamaica Plain.
Are you familiar with the Dudley Street neighborhood? Does that connect with Jamaica Plain?
I think it's close by. I'm not sure if it's
right.
And I was right downtown, so I never had to.
Right.
Everything I needed to do was all right. I lived right on
Yep.
Main Street, so it was great. But
So-
it was true though. Like the guy who owned the pizza place would go to the hardware store next door and get something that he needed to, and then the next day the guy from the hardware store would go into his pizza place. You know what I mean? And it was so the money. Everybody's making money, but it's just kind of just going back and forth. It's never even leaving the neighborhood.
That's exactly right, and that's what needs to happen. And that's that money merry-go-round. So you want that money to recycle within the community.
Right.
And so when you make your purchases with a chain store, rather than a local independent hardware store,
you don't know where that money goes.
To Home Depot or Lowe's or something like that.
Right.
You get that money recirculating, and so you create that money merry-go-round that a local economy needs, and a local community needs in terms of maintaining those supportive networks and relationships. And it's all about mutual aid. And certainly, given the failure of our healthcare system, given the failure of, thankfully, the past administration, those institutions were not able to meet the demand or the need local people and local communities came together in organizing mutual aid assistance programs, and taking care of each other. And I think those are also very important, but a testament to the kind of community that has addressed address those networks. But I said Dudley Street initiative in Boston.
Yeah.
Similar situation where this neighborhood, low income, high crime, really in a sense no local businesses, parks, other kinds of things. So over the last number of decades, they've been focusing in on rebuilding that neighborhood, and in terms of housing, in terms of providing recreation and parks, community gardens, better support of family-run businesses, and allowed that Dudley Street neighborhood in Boston to reemerge. And and again, I think they're prepared to deal with something like this, to deal with COVID, at least better prepared. And yet another example of what you can do to rebuild a community, and how you can sustain it in a way that makes it possible for people to live in a community where they want to live. And we've done that similar thing in Warner, but a lot of neighborhoods, a lot of communities around the country, have been doing this work, and they're sure in a lot better shape to deal with with this current pandemic. Because there's other, we're in the midst of multiple pandemics, and it's healthcare related to our healthcare. It's related to the environment. It's related to racial and economic injustice. So I think offering an approach that enables you to deal effectively with these things, but always through keeping your focus on the local and what you can do in your own community, in your own neighborhood, and in a city, perhaps even in your own, on your own block. So again, I think we've taken this experience that we've had over the years and applied it in a very tangible way. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to open up the bookstore, because we didn't want to just talk about these things in an abstract way. We didn't want to commute to, just work on a lot of issues. We wanted to establish something tangible and real in the community in which we decided to live in. And I think as a result, it certainly has paid off in a very positive way.
So the last time we spoke, you were telling me about all of these projects that you've been working with in the community. So could you tell me a little bit more about that? That was pretty cool. You talked about just community like activities and projects and stuff like that, and it was very interesting.
Right.
And
yeah, and I think again, not just focusing in on retail and running a business, appreciating the broader community. So we're taking a whole community approach, right? So what that means is that you pay attention to a lot of other things. And one of the things we did back in 2000 was to establish a 501c3 nonprofit, Main Street Warner. And the mission was to really focus not only on Warner's Main Street and Main Street businesses, but we extended that to the arts, trying to better support the arts and education, sort of addressing in that sense, the cultural needs of the community. So we put together this nonprofit, and since 2000, we've been offering all sorts of events, programs, concerts, theater, these kind of things. We have a ongoing literacy project with our local elementary school, and So Catherine and I, as well as Catherine's brother Jim, started the nonprofit with that in mind. In fact, when we opened up the bookstore 22 years ago, we started a Friday night on Main Street series. And we made a commitment that every Friday night, we'd have, a music, we'd have music, we'd have a concert, we'd have various programs, and we started to offer some theater production. And then in 2008, my brother-in-law Jim died, before his death in 2008, we were starting to think about putting together a community park around the bookstore. Got about an acre around the bookstore, and it was an overgrown lot, basically. So we started to make plans to develop a community park with an outdoor stage and amphitheater. And so when Jim died, the community came together and said, we're going to put this park together. We're going to construct this park. And so in 2010, 2 years later, we opened up the Jim Mitchell Community Park. And shortly after, we, through community support, in-kind contributions, good work of timber framers and carpenters, we put together a timber frame stage in the park. And the seating capacity in this in the park is about 400, which is pretty fantastic. 100% solar powered as well. So what we did is at the bookstore, we turned the land over to the nonprofit so that the park will always remain a community asset. And no matter what happens to the bookstore, to the building, the physical structure, it will always remain as a community park and administered by Main Street Warner or another nonprofit. So so that's 2010, and that was in the sort of the midst of the economic collapse of 2007 and 2008. So we forged ahead in that climate, in that disaster at that time. So just this past September, an incredible historic building came up for sale in the center of Warner. It was built in 1833 as a Baptist church. In 1964, the Masons took it over, and at that point it was a Masonic lodge. So the Masons, in kind of concentrating, their organization, closing down a number of lodges around the state, put this on the market. And it's a beautiful 3,000 square foot building. The main hall is a little over 2,000 square feet. And so we were able, thanks again to community support, able to make the purchase in this past September. And in the midst of all of this, we brought the food pantry here in Warner under our umbrella, the nonprofit's umbrella, Main Street Warner. And so this lodge also has space to develop a commercial kitchen, which we'll work on this year, so that we can support the food pantry and their increased demand with being able to process and store local produce and other items. Helping strengthen the local food economy, all our local farmers, giving people that need the food pantry, giving them access to local fresh produce. So we're working on raising funds to put together a commercial kitchen in the lodge. And, we'll have walk-in freezers, walk-in coolers. So the products, the local food that we, and produce that we process, we can store and distribute throughout the year. And we'll also be putting together educational programs in nutrition, meal preparation, looking forward to having farm-to-table suppers. And in the main lodge, which has about a 200-seat capacity, that'll serve as a year-round indoor venue for concerts and programs. And so again, it's just adjacent to the park and the bookstore. But Main Street Warner, here we are 10 years later in the midst of another crisis.
Yeah.
Both an economic crisis and a public healthcare crisis. So I guess it takes a crisis for Main Street Warner to put something like this together. And so we're really looking forward to spending this year doing the needed renovation to the building, putting in place the commercial kitchen, getting that going, and then hopefully being able to open up to the public in early 2022. So it preserves an historic building in the center of town, but it also makes it possible for this incredible building to be used in service of the community, as it has been since the 1800s. So we're really very excited about this. And so again, we've always said, and this has been sort of the tagline of the nonprofit, there's always something wonderful happening in Warner. And that's always been the case. And none of this could happen if it wasn't for the community itself.
Right.
And the kind of support that they continue to give not only the bookstore, but also the nonprofit Main Street Warner. And yet, what we've done, in the park before COVID, every weekend through the summer and early fall, we had concerts and performances, theater, and that makes it possible for people to, and I think, have something offered locally that they can depend on and enjoy. So, we'll continue. We'll continue with that. We had to shut down the park, obviously this past year, and so when we're able to reemerge, we're going to need these kind of things, these venues, more than we ever did before. So again, we're looking forward to that.
It sounds awesome. It sounds awesome. I wish more towns would do that.
Well, a lot of people, a lot of community, people in a lot of communities around the state as well as New England. I've asked, how did you do this? How can I do this?
Yeah.
And I think this can happen in every community. It can happen in every neighborhood. And I think it just requires people to focus on where they live and decide to do something. Pick something. There's plenty to do. But and I think that's where it all begins. And if anything is going to happen, certainly in a positive way, it's going to happen in your own backyard. And that's where you start. At least that's what I've learned over the years, that, focus on where you live and, and I think, and then, sort of work from there and work out from there. So, we, can talk about how things work. We can talk about what has worked for us, and to be able to share that with others. May not work for you in the same way.
Right.
But at least we're not speaking about these things in a hypothetical or theoretical way. But again, something that, is very tangible, something that's very real. And then you go on from there. And, and I think when we opened up the bookstore, 22 years ago, we were losing our main street. We were losing our businesses, the local grocery store, other stores. And so we're fortunate enough to have this property where the bookstore is right now for sale. So we knew we had to do something. And since then, we have an independent pharmacy. We've got several restaurants, and they're hanging on the best they can. We worked with some folks that started the Warner Public Market, which is essentially a food co-op across the street from us that offer local products, produce, those kinds of things. So, and I think we've been able to have some success, and it just one success builds on another. And we've coordinated with the public market in terms of hours, through this pandemic, and really all the local businesses have been coordinating together to deal with this. So, again, I remain hopeful that we will emerge, and we haven't stopped doing anything that we've done before.
Right.
We've shifted, things a little bit, but we will continue to have a pretty significant presence. So, the business, but also the nonprofit. And again, it's going back to this whole community approach that I think is necessary to maintain your communities. And this also extends to, to land use, and make sure that agricultural land is able to survive. And right now we've gathered a number of people together to start looking at developing a Warner area land trust to be able to hold and maintain land to use in productive ways in terms of agriculture, but also preserve forest and manage forest land in an ecological way. So that's another offshoot of what's happening as well. So again, we'll continue along a variety of paths here.
So what are some things that are maybe more concerning to you, like things that may cause a little bit of discomfort or worry, like in the current situation, as a in relation to COVID?
Well, like a lot of crises and a lot of pandemic, a lot of crises, let's say, things that may have appeared to be invisible become visible. And a lot of things have surfaced that have been persistent problems, throughout the country. And, with us in particular, the lack of accessible and affordable health care, the lack of, getting a college education without going into incredible debt.
Tell me about it.
Not having access to the kind of work that can give you a livable wage. And, always, having to deal with this, underlining, this level of inequality in terms of our income, wealth and income inequality, and the inability of too many people not being able to support themselves and their family, provide their families with healthcare and education, created a situation where in 2016, we were well on our way to a more authoritarian political environment. And certainly this past president and those who have gone along with him have put us in a situation where racism, uh, massive wealth and income inequality, uh, all these issues that are connected. Really a resurgence of fascism and fascist ideology,
Yeah.
pushing more and more people to think that the way to resolve their social problems is to act in more authoritarian, repressive ways, and to use race, to use immigration, to use all of these things to pit people against one another. Has put us yet again in a very dangerous situation. And, while we've been able to close the door on this former president and his administration, there's a
Yeah,
lot
the
of
mess
damage.
is,
There's a lot of damage to repair. And actually what concerns me most is whether the current administration will be able to act in a way to finally help to resolve these problems. And, my hope is that, it gives us at least an opportunity to work more seriously on this. But I think we're at a very dangerous turning point historically, where, we have to deal with all of these multiple pandemics. We have to deal with the environmental crisis. We have to deal with the crisis of racism, sexism, wealth and income inequality. And, if we don't, I'm fearful that, whatever we are able to accomplish in our local communities won't be successful enough to, sort of, buffer this. I think it gives us an opportunity to buffer more of these aspects, but we can't do it without a greater focus on these issues at the national level. So, and I think, that's what concerns me the most. I mean, again, COVID has revealed a lot about what we've failed to accomplish over the years that put us in a situation that we find ourselves in today, unable to respond effectively to this public health care crisis, because we didn't take seriously enough how important it is to have universal care for everybody. And, we're suffering as a result, never fully taking care of the legacy and history of racism. We're suffering as a result. Never dealing with gender inequality. And, we're suffering as a result. Never taking seriously enough the environmental crisis, and we're suffering as a result. So, again, we try to do as much as we can in our own communities, and we need a lot of other communities that are acting in a similar way. But it's my hope that, we can have, greater national focus and success that would only, assist in dealing with these problems. We'll see what happens.
yeah, only time will tell.
Ryan, you gotta get to work. But I know you've done, we talked earlier, and you were involved in the community garden that connects with the campus. Volunteering at the Friendly Kitchen.
Yeah,
These are
cooking a few
all
meals over there. It's
very important ways to connect people and connect a variety of people.
and it's rewarding too. It makes you feel
isn't it?
good.
Absolutely, it does, and that's very contagious. And that community garden is a reflection of the diversity of the Concord community. The community that garden serves is incredibly diverse.
Yeah, most of the people that I ran into over the summer were, I'm assuming, refugees or
Absolutely.
whatever, and
Oh yes, you bet.
it's kind of them being able to bring their own I don't want to say rituals, but
No, their
their
own,
own customs with them,
absolutely.
and go and say, hey, we're gonna go. You know what I mean? I was the only one there that was there by myself, and and they were, oh, hey, because you see the same people all the time, so you get friendly
Yep,
with them, and
yep,
hey, what are you growing over there? And you kind of, oh, hey,
absolutely.
try this. This might help you out, or oh no,
Right.
try it this way, and
Yep.
and it's really
That
it was
these
it's
are
fun.
these are community building things.
Yeah,
In this case, it's done around gardening,
right.
and and it
And
really
I
is
was
something. And
able
I
to,
think you take a look at community gardens, and I know there's a wonderful community garden in Lewiston, Maine,
yeah,
Lewiston, Auburn, and uh, it's really started uh, because of the new arrivals, the refugees, the immigrants that have come in. Uh, didn't have access to the food they were used to eating. So what they've done is, getting access to the land in Lewiston, having
well,
this
yeah. I
community
mean,
garden.
you get people from another country, they might be unfamiliar with, what the hell is this? I want to eat
Well,
food that I'm used to eating.
of
So
course,
this gives them a chance to, provided the soil is good and the environment is good,
that's right.
the climate or whatever, it gives them an opportunity to kind of, feel a little bit comfortable in a strange place. They get to eat their own food, stuff
Yeah,
they've been used to
yep,
eating, stuff
yep.
that they know they like, where, they might come here to the United States and what the hell's a rutabaga? I don't want to eat that. Or,
Well, they
whatever.
probably know what it is, but at least it gives them an alternative to, thinking that, uh, you know, uh, well, it's more than the stuff you get at McDonald's or something like that.
Oh,
You get access to real food, and
yeah.
but what that does is not only give people access to food and access to the land, even in an urban center, but also helps to maintain those important relationships with each other and the broader community and the broader community.
Yeah, and like when I was doing the guy, I would take a little bit for myself, and the most of it went right over to the friendly kitchen.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, I don't know if any of that food got used. I did go there for dinner a few times over the summer. I didn't see any familiar looking vegetables that came out of the garden. So whatever. I mean, I
Oh
did
yeah.
my part, and if they don't
Uh,
want to use them, that's
well,
up to them.
well, and
Once I
that's
give the vegetables to them, it's it's theirs to do with whatever they want.
so. I mean, in terms of what we sort of unfortunately get accustomed to eating, all this highly processed food, it really isn't real food,
That's,
and
yeah, it's not good.
we're all getting that pushed on us, and so that's another reason why we wanted to uh, connect with the food pantry, because we not only wanted to help them meet the increased demand, but also we felt it essential to give people access to real food, healthy food, and so rather than just processed food, canned goods, things like that, uh, combining with the food pantry, putting in this commercial kitchen, uh, being able to process and store fresh food to make increasingly available to people uh, was something that, I think just in terms of one's health and nutritional value of the food you're eating is so important. And so it does help the local farmers. They were always very generous in terms of, giving, fresh produce to the pantry. But, you know, it has it doesn't last forever. Uh, so being able to process this food, to freeze it, keep it in coolers, uh, extends the shelf life, but
Mhm.
also, as I'd said before, it gives people access to this good food um, year round, year round. And so, I think, uh, while we have access to these wonderful organic farmers in and around Warner, the food pantry actually is located in a Warner Community Center, which is down the street from the lodge and the bookstore. But that space has a lot of room for a huge community garden. And so we want to plant some things around the community center. And the same is the case for where the solar array is at our recycling center. Again, there's almost an acre there that can be used as a community garden. So even in a reasonably rural town like Warner, we want to give people access to garden space if they don't have it at their homes or wherever they're living. So I think putting in a community garden, like a community park, is a place for people to gather. And
even just a flower garden. I mean, you're outside, you're getting fresh air,
absolutely,
you're getting sunlight, you're still socializing with people, you're getting something to do. And the act of gardening itself, it's hard work, but it's also very therapeutic. Almost you could almost substitute that for people who are very into things like meditation and stuff. Gardening could be considered a form of meditation. You're communicating with the environment, and you're kind of focusing on, you're in the zone. The same way, a race car driver or a football player or a baseball player gets in the zone.
Right.
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 And it's there were some lovely gardens, mostly in Boston. They were mostly flower gardens, but people there, they're in a good mood. I mean, you never saw an angry gardener before.
Well, I don't know.
I mean, this is kind of fixes some of it. This damn tractor keeps breaking down, but I mean, for the most part, they're pretty easy-going, happy, happy people for the most part.
Right. Yeah, I
especially
agree.
If they're doing it for their leisure instead of commercially or to pay the bills.
But even then, I mean, I grew up on a farm in Iowa. We left in the mid '60s, and it's we've always said, and I think it's still true. You don't do farming for the money; you do it for the love. And but it's a connection with the land that's so important. And getting your hands dirty, and that that's a good thing. So
I used to, and you can call me crazy if you like.
I've never done that.
I used to bring my phone with me and play music while I was doing it. For my own good, but there is that in the back of my mind. There's that whole, hey, plants are receptive to the vibrations. How true it is, I don't know. I mean, I benefited from it because I get to listen to music, and I mean, I got some pretty good looking vegetables out of the deal. So
there you go.
I mean, I didn't do much. I just stuck some seeds in the ground and gave it some water every once in a while and pulled out the weeds. So
there you go. All right. That's good.
That's good. It was cool.
All right. Well, I mean, it's like Native people. Everything. We're connected to everything, one to another. And, so being connected to the earth is so important. And I think the extent to which we've become disconnected from the earth connects with how disconnected we've become.
I believe that.
So everything, it's a living earth. This everything has life, everything has value, and that what that does is produce greater equality. It produces more egalitarian, democratically run societies, I think. So maintaining those important connections to each other and to the natural environment are so important. And to live your life in that way. And I think it's possible anywhere, but it's certainly most possible in terms of where you actually live. So it's an appreciation for the place, that sense of place, that you can become rooted in a place and be able to appreciate that. And I think that makes it possible for us to not only be healthy in a more personal or individual way, but it also provides the foundation for a healthier culture, healthier society.
It's funny that you say that, because I left Concord to go to Boston for better opportunities. I mean, it's not really in Concord itself. There's, what are you going to do? I can go work for Dunkin' Donuts or any number of chain restaurants, low paying, unappreciated jobs, which I was tired of. And I went down to Boston, and only to find out 2 years later, I came back to Concord, because those roots, like you said, those roots were already planted. So I came back.
Yep.
Do I want to go back to Boston? Yeah, sure. There is more opportunities for jobs. There's more, I mean, there's different kinds of benefits down there than there are here. But, I've been living it, on and off. I mean, I left for a couple of years, but, the over 10 years I lived in Concord, and about 15 years total in New Hampshire. And I like it better in New Hampshire. There's not as much opportunity, but there's more community.
Well, I've lived in big cities. I lived in DC for a while. And in DC, I focused on a particular neighborhood, which was helpful, and did a lot of the things in that neighborhood that, we've been talking about. But I think, maybe it's growing up on a farm at a time when we actually had small farms. We had livestock on farms. We didn't have these massive feedlots. We all farmed organically. We didn't call it that. That's just what you did.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I've always been most comfortable in smaller communities in rural areas. In fact, when I first started graduate school at University of Connecticut in 1976, I started out in the rural sociology department. And so that's been a major focus for me in my academic work. But also, I think just personally, I've felt most comfortable when I'm able to get access to the land and more of a rural setting. So Warner has been a great place to get comfortable. And so I'm happy we made the decision to move to Warner now, 36 years ago. So
yeah,
it's been okay. And I think we'll stay.
Yeah.
Well, this seems like a good place to close things out, huh?